This is my true story. I raised 5 sons who grew up waiting for funeral. They didn't visit me out of love, only to count what they'd inherit. When I spoke, they rolled their eyes. When I coughed, they smirked. The day I died, they finally came together, not in grief, but in greed. I watched from a distance as they kicked my coffin and laughed over it, thinking the old fool was gone at last. They had no idea I was still breathing and planning. Next morning, I was standing at their doorstep. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so more people hear my story. It didn't start all at once. Disrespect grows slow, like rust on iron. At first it was small things. One son rolling his eyes when I repeated a story, another pretending not to hear when I called. Then came the sighs, the whispers, the way they spoke about me as if I wasn't in the room. They forgot I built everything they had, the house, the land, the money, all carried on my back when I was young and strong. When their mother died, I thought grief had hardened them. I told myself time would soften it. I was wrong. Time didn't heal them. It spoiled them. They started to treat me like furniture that took up too much space. The meals I cooked for them became jokes. My advice became noise. They talked to me like I was already gone. I remember one Sunday dinner. My oldest son said, "Dad, you should sell the house before you forget who we are." They laughed. All 5 of them. I smiled, but inside I felt something break. The kind of break you can't fix. I realized then that I wasn't part of their world anymore. I was just the shadow standing in the corner of it. They stopped helping me around the farm. The tools rusted. The barn started to sag. When I couldn't lift the heavy crates, they didn't step in. They walked past. "You're too old for this," they'd say, but they never took over. They wanted the reward, not the work. Every night, I sat in that empty kitchen, the clock ticking louder than ever. I thought about all the years I'd spent building a name and how fast they'd stripped it of meaning. I used to dream about leaving something behind for them. Now I just wanted to leave. What hurt most wasn't their words. It was the way they looked at me. Like I was a stranger. Like the man who held them as babies didn't matter anymore. They forgot who fixed their broken toys, who stayed awake when they were sick, who kept them fed when money was tight. They forgot everything except what they thought I still owed them. It's strange how silence changes when love dies. The same house that once held laughter started to echo with indifference. They stopped saying Dad. They started calling me the old man. When guests came over, they spoke like I wasn't there. "He's still hanging on," they'd say, chuckling, like I was a weed that refused to die. I swallowed it all. Every insult, every glance, every cruel joke said under breath but meant to be heard. I sat through dinners where they mocked my age and talked about the will as if I was deaf. But I wasn't deaf. I was listening, memorizing. By the time the youngest stopped visiting altogether, I knew what I had to do. You can't change what people have become. You can only show them what they've created. They wanted my death more than my life, so I gave them one they'd never forget. The night before it happened, I looked in the mirror for a long time. My face looked old, yes, but not weak. I whispered to my reflection, "They'll regret this." And for the first time in years, I believed it. They thought I was too tired to fight. But they didn't understand. There's no strength stronger than a man who's already lost everything. It happened one night in late November. The air was cold, the kind that bites your bones. I sat by the fireplace, listening to the wind push against the windows. My sons were in the other room, arguing, not about me, but about my money. They didn't bother to whisper anymore. They thought I couldn't hear. The words cut deeper than any knife could. "Once he's gone, I'll take the house. You can have the land. I'll take the truck. He doesn't need any of it where he's going." Their laughter followed, sharp and mean. It echoed through the walls like ghosts mocking the living. I sat there staring at the fire, watching the flames dance. Every crackle sounded like their voices. Every ember looked like a piece of my past burning away. I realized then, they weren't my sons anymore. They were strangers raised by my labor, but not by my values. Something inside me went cold. The kind of cold that doesn't fade with heat or time. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. Just clarity. I understood that night what they truly wanted. My death wasn't tragedy to them. It was convenience. I went to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the old chest at the foot of it. The one that held every document, every deed, every secret. I had built everything with care. They thought I was old and foolish, but I had always been one step ahead. That's what age gives you. Time to learn how people think when they believe you're too weak to notice. The next morning, I called my lawyer. He had been with me since the early days, a quiet man, loyal and discreet. When I told him what I wanted, he went silent for a long time. Then he said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. My voice didn't shake. I told him I wanted to give them exactly what they'd been waiting for. A funeral. Mine. For weeks we planned it in secret. I signed the papers, arranged the accounts, and built the illusion. The doctors played their part. A collapse at home, a sudden heart failure, all believable, all clean. My lawyer handled the rest, the will, the estate, the body they thought they buried. Every detail perfect, every lie dressed in truth. When the time came, I watched the news of my own death on television. My name flashed across the screen. My photograph faded into black. The world believed it. My sons believed it. At first I thought I would feel guilt. I didn't. What I felt was peace. For the first time in years, I could see clearly. No noise, no disrespect, no pretense. Just silence. The kind of silence that belongs to the dead. The day of the funeral, I stood far back among the trees, hidden under a dark coat. The wind was cold, but I didn't shiver. My sons arrived one by one, black suits, polished shoes, faces blank. They didn't cry. Not a single one. They stood there like men attending a business deal, waiting for the paperwork to finish. When the service ended, they lingered by the coffin. I watched from the shadows as one of them laughed and nudged the other. Then they kicked the coffin. Not once, but twice. Laughed harder. The others joined in. My own blood, my own flesh. Laughing at the man who gave them everything. That was the breaking point. Not the insults, not the greed. That moment. Watching them mock death like it was a joke. Watching them treat me as less than human. I didn't feel sorrow anymore. I felt power. Because they thought I was gone. But I was standing right there, watching, breathing, waiting. They thought they buried me that day. But they buried something else. Their last chance at mercy. When the last shovel of dirt hit the coffin, I turned away and walked back to the truck parked behind the trees. My lawyer sat in the driver's seat, engine running, no words spoken. He looked at me through the mirror, eyes uncertain. I told him, "Now we begin." That was the night the plan truly started. Every step had been arranged long before my death. While my sons laughed at the funeral, I was legally erasing their future. The power of signatures. That's something they never understood. They thought control came from loud voices and threats. But real power hides in quiet paperwork. And I had been signing in silence for months. The plan was simple but cruelly clean. My estate, every acre, every account, every share, had already been transferred out of my name before I died. My lawyer and a small charity organization became the temporary holders, a mask for the real move I would make once the show was over. Every asset connected to my sons, from their houses to their business accounts, had been tied one way or another to me. When I went under, so did their security. We spent 2 days finalizing the final stroke. In one sweep, their comfort, their inheritance, and their arrogance would vanish. My lawyer's words were calm, but I saw the worry behind them. "They'll come after you when they find out," he said. I smiled. "They can't come after a dead man." The next step was patience. I disappeared completely. I had a small cabin 3 hours north, isolated, quiet, off the grid. No phone, no noise, only the sound of the wind through old trees. That's where I waited. Days passed slow, but peace returned. I hadn't felt peace in years. I could finally think without their voices in my head. On the third day, I got the call, a coded message from my lawyer's assistant. The documents were filed. The transfers were official. The empire they thought was theirs now belonged to no one. Frozen. Locked. Untouchable. But the final part of the plan wasn't on paper, it was personal. I wrote 5 letters, one for each son. No explanations, no apologies, just a single line inside each. What you buried wasn't your father. It was your inheritance. The letters were mailed the night before I planned to return. Not to scare them, but to prepare them. Fear works best when it begins slow, when it crawls through the cracks of arrogance and turns into panic. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from guilt, from anticipation. I thought about every insult, every laugh, every moment they made me feel small. I remembered the faces of boys I had carried in my arms, who had grown into men with hearts made of stone. I had begged for their respect once. Now they would beg for my forgiveness. Before dawn, I packed what little I needed. The suit I wore to my wife's funeral, my walking cane, and a small envelope of documents. I looked in the mirror one last time. The man staring back at me looked old, yes, but not weak. His eyes were steady. His purpose was clear. As the first light of morning broke, I drove south toward the town where they lived. The streets were quiet. My hands didn't shake on the wheel. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of age, or time, or death. I was their ghost, and ghosts don't die twice. When I reached the first house, I stopped the car and waited until I saw movement inside. Curtains opening, lights flicking on. The beginning of another day they thought would be theirs to control. It wasn't. That morning, my 5 sons would wake up to a world that no longer belonged to them, and a father they thought was buried 6 feet under, standing right at their doors. The funeral was supposed to be a moment of respect, a final goodbye, a place where tears would fall, not laughter. But I knew my sons too well. Respect had died in them long before I faked my own death. I arrived early that morning, before anyone else. The chapel was quiet, smelling of cold wood and lilies. My coffin sat at the front, closed and heavy, surrounded by wreaths that meant nothing. I watched from behind the curtains in the side hall, dressed like one of the staff. No one looked twice at an old man in a black cap carrying a clipboard. When the doors opened, they came in one by one. My sons, 5 men dressed in suits they didn't earn. They looked serious, but not sad. Their faces were dry, their eyes scanning the room like vultures checking if the feast was ready. The youngest leaned toward the oldest and whispered something. They both smirked. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I'd seen that same smirk 1,000 times before. They stood around the coffin as the pastor spoke about my good life. None of them bowed their heads. None of them prayed. They didn't see a father in that box. They saw property. They saw freedom. They saw a name finally erased so they could take what was left. When the service ended, people began to leave. That's when I saw it. My oldest son walking up to the coffin, resting his hand on the lid. For a second, I thought maybe he would whisper something kind. But then he laughed. A deep, cruel laugh that didn't belong in a place of mourning. The others joined in. The second one tapped the coffin with his shoe like he was testing if it was hollow. Then the third one, the one who used to sit on my shoulders as a boy, gave it a hard kick. The sound echoed in the empty chapel. "Guess he's really gone now," he said. They all burst out laughing. I stood there behind the curtain, heart pounding, fists clenched. I could feel my pulse in my ears, feel the heat rise in my chest. I wanted to walk out right then, to face them, to show them that death hadn't taken me. But patience is sharper than anger, and my revenge wasn't finished yet. The pastor looked shocked, but said nothing. Most people had left by then. My sons stayed behind, talking about selling the land, dividing the business, who would take my old truck. They spoke with greed, dripping from every word. Not one of them mentioned love. Not one. When they finally walked out, I stayed. I waited until the doors closed and the lights dimmed. Then I walked up to my own coffin. My hand brushed against the wood. It was smooth, polished, too fine for what it contained. I leaned forward, whispering to the empty box. "They think they buried me." Let's make sure they wish they had. I looked around the room one last time, the flowers wilting already, the candles burning low. Everything about that day was fake. The tears, the speeches, the grief, all lies. The only truth left in that chapel was standing behind the curtain, breathing, planning. When I left, I didn't take the main road. I walked through the side gate, unseen. The wind outside was cold, cutting across my face. But for the first time in years, I smiled. Because now, I had something stronger than anger. I had time, and time is the weapon of the patient. That night, I sat in the dark and replayed every second, the laughter, the kicks, the words. They thought they were free. They thought they had won. But they didn't know that the dead can still write letters, still make calls, still pull strings. And when the sun rose again, they would learn that the man they buried didn't stay buried. The anger sat heavy in my chest like a coal that would not cool. It did not burn out. It burned slow and steady. It kept me awake at night. I thought of every cruel laugh. I thought of every kick against the wood. I thought of the way they spoke of my name like a thing to be used and thrown away. That coal became a plan. It gave me a kind of calm I had not felt in years. I did not want violence. I wanted justice. I wanted them to feel loss the way I had felt loss. I wanted them to learn what it is to stand with empty hands and no one to blame but themselves. So I turned the coal to duty. I called my lawyer and spoke clear and short. We would not shout. We would do the work that makes walls fall without a sound. He asked me questions. I answered. Each answer closed one door and opened a trap they could not see. I had kept records, like any man who owned land and ran a small business. Receipts, deeds, bank papers, contracts. I had not known then that those quiet things would be the tools I needed. The lawyer told me to gather every paper that showed who owed what and who had signatures where. I dug them out. My hands shook at first, but steadied. Every paper felt like a piece of truth I had hidden for years without knowing why. We moved money where they could not reach, not to strangers, not to waste, to people and places I trusted. The lawyer set up a trust under names of workers who had helped me when no one else had. The charity that cared for the old and the sick got a slice. The local school that taught my grandsons to read got a slice. Small things, honest things. The houses and fields that had fed 5 mouths for decades were tied up in ways the sons could not break with a call or a signature. I wrote every instruction in plain words and signed with a hand that no longer trembled with fear. The lawyer warned me of fights. They will come, he said. They will shout and file papers. They will try to tear things down. I did not fear their cries. I feared only that my anger would make me small like them. I would not be small, so we made the work clean, papers in order, witnesses lined up. The transfers were not stolen, they were legal, they closed like a lock. At night I sat in the little cabin I kept away from town and watched the sky. I thought of how slow this kind of revenge is. Not quick like a curse, slow like winter that turns fields white and quiet. The burning inside me did not go out, but it turned from rage into a clear heat that kept me moving. I stopped thinking of who they had been. I thought of what they had done. The line is thin. Men cross it without seeing. I had seen it clear. I also used the phone, not to shout, to remind. I called banks and left formal notes, not threats, documents. I set alerts to freeze accounts if any of them tried to move money tied to my name. I called the county office and quietly arranged for deeds to be checked. There was no drama, only the slow work of law and paper. That kind of work hides well from men who live on quick gains. Once a neighbor came by and asked if I wanted help. I said no. This was mine. I had built my life with my hands. I would end this with my mind. The neighbor nodded, but I know he could see the fire in me. He did not ask the rest. Old men watch and do not ask. The night before I moved the final pieces, I wrote 5 short notes, not angry words, not revenge speeches, just facts. Each said where their accounts were frozen and how they could call the lawyers who now held the papers. I did not want to humiliate them with words. The law would do the work. I left one copy with my lawyer. One copy I sent to a small paper that served our town. Truth speaks loud on its own. By dawn, everything was set. The coal inside me had burned into iron. I felt ready. I felt empty and full at once. The plan did not need my shout. It needed my quiet hand. I left the cabin with my coat on, cane in hand, and the tiny envelope in my pocket. I walked the long road back to where my sons lived. The sun rose thin over the field. I did not hurry. They would wake in a house that felt secure. They would step into kitchens they thought were theirs. Then the phone calls would start. The letters would come. The bank would lock. The papers would show names that were not theirs. The empire they built on my work would become pages of ink and nothing more. I did not smile. The burning inside me had become a lantern. It lit the path I had to take. I walked to their doors like a man who had done what needed to be done. The hard work of years had been unmade by truth and law. I was ready to watch them learn what it means to lose what you thought you earned. That night, I didn't sleep. The laughter from the funeral kept echoing in my head like a curse. I sat by the window, watching the moon bleed through the trees, and realized there was nothing left to lose. A dead man doesn't need mercy. He needs closure. Before sunrise, I drove into town. My lawyer met me at the back door of his office. No questions, no pity. The papers were ready, every signature in place, every account shifted. My 5 sons would wake up rich men and go to bed with nothing. Everything I'd built, every acre of land, every penny, gone from their hands, locked, rewritten, transferred. He slid the last envelope toward me. "Once this is delivered, there's no turning back," he said. I nodded. There's nothing to turn back to. By midnight, I sent out the letters. 5 envelopes, one for each son, each sealed with my name, the name they buried without care. Inside was not forgiveness, just truth. Proof that their inheritance was gone, and a single line that read, "You buried me too early." I poured myself a drink and waited for morning. The world outside was silent, but my blood wasn't. My heart beat steady, not from rage, but from a cold kind of calm. I'd been humiliated in life. I would be remembered in death. When dawn came, I drove back to town and parked where no one would see. From the car, I watched the houses, one by one, come alive. Lights flicked on, curtains shifted, then came the shouting, the phone calls, the panic. One ran outside barefoot, waving papers from the bank. Another slammed his car door and sped off toward my lawyer's office. Their world was cracking, and I didn't move. For 30 years, they made me feel small. That morning, they finally understood what small really meant. They buried their father and laughed. Now, they were the ones being buried. Not by dirt, but by their own greed. I didn't smile. Revenge isn't joy. It's justice, dressed in silence. The morning they woke was not gentle. It was the kind of morning that breaks a man before he even stands up. The sun was out, but their world was already dark. By 7, the first bank froze the accounts. By 8, the lawyers called with questions they couldn't answer. By 9, the deeds to their houses had been pulled from their names. The same papers they used to brag about were now stamped in red, transferred. Neighbors said they saw one of them sitting on the front steps in his boxers, phone in hand, staring at a message from the bank. Another stood in the yard screaming, throwing stones at a "for sale" sign that wasn't there the night before. The youngest tried calling me first. Then he called the lawyer, then the police. But there was no one to blame. You can't arrest a dead man. Their wives cried. Their kids watched in silence. The men who once mocked my shaking hands now shook worse than I ever did. The strong ones suddenly couldn't stand. The proud ones hid inside. The silence that followed was sweeter than any apology they could have given. By noon, the news spread through town. People whispered, "The old man took it all." They didn't know how right they were. I hadn't just taken their money. I'd taken their comfort, their safety, the empire they thought would last forever. Each house carried my fingerprints, every lock, every wall, every room they once ignored me in. I had built it all with my bare hands. They just filled it with noise. Now, they'd learn what silence really sounds like. I parked down the road from the old farmhouse, the one that used to be mine. The windows were open. I could hear them shouting inside, arguing over who was to blame. I didn't move closer. I wanted them to feel it. The confusion, the panic, the slow dawning that everything they took for granted was gone. The lawyer had done his job perfectly. My name was nowhere. The assets were buried behind trusts, charities, and people who actually deserved them. The farm was donated to the local orphanage, the same one I once volunteered at before my sons called it a waste of time. My company shares went to the workers who never missed a shift. My savings, all of it, divided among people who'd earned it with kindness, not blood. Every signature was legal, every transaction clean. Their lawyers could scream, threaten, or beg, but it wouldn't matter. The law was now my coffin, and inside it, my sons were trapped. Around 10 a.m., one of them spotted me through the windshield as I sat in the car. He froze, his face drained of color, and I saw his lips form my name. The others ran to the window. For a second, they didn't breathe. Then they stumbled out the door like they'd seen a ghost, because in their minds, they had 5 men, pale and broken, standing barefoot in the dirt, staring at the father they buried yesterday. Their mouths opened, but no words came out. I stepped out of the car slowly, the cane tapping against the ground. No anger, no smile, just silence. The kind that says everything words can't. They looked at me like I'd come from the grave. Maybe I had. The grave they built with their greed. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. Their faces were enough. Shock, fear, guilt. All of it mixing like poison in their eyes. They finally understood the truth. I hadn't died. I had simply given them a chance to show who they really were. And now, they would live with it. When I stepped out of the car, the ground felt heavier than ever before. The same dirt they had shoveled over my coffin now sat beneath my shoes. The air was still, as if even the wind wanted to see what would happen next. My 5 sons stood in a crooked line, frozen on the porch. Faces pale, eyes wide, all pride gone. The loud men who once mocked me now looked like frightened children. I walked slow, each step was measured. The cane hit the ground like a drumbeat, steady and calm. I wanted them to hear it, to feel it. The sound of the man they buried walking back toward them. Their lips moved, trying to find words, but no sound came out. The oldest finally whispered, "You're dead." His voice cracked. I looked him in the eye and said nothing. I just kept walking until I stood at the bottom of the steps, close enough to see their fear. Their mother used to say silence was louder than anger. She was right. They began to tremble, not because I was alive, but because they knew, deep down, that I had seen everything. The laughter, the kicks, the greed. The youngest tried to step forward. "Dad," he started, but the word died in his throat. The moment he said it, he remembered how he had laughed the loudest. I could see the memory hit him. I didn't need to remind him. His guilt did the work for me. I climbed the steps one by one. None of them moved. I could feel the tension in the air, thick like smoke before a storm. When I reached the top, I looked at them all, one after another. Their eyes darted away like cowards caught stealing. I said only one thing. "You buried me too early." No shouting, no lectures, just that. Then I handed the oldest a brown envelope. He hesitated before taking it. Inside were copies of the legal papers, deeds, transfers, proof that every bit of land, money, and business they thought they owned was gone. I watched as his face twisted, disbelief first, then confusion, then panic. His knees gave out. He dropped the envelope and backed away. The others grabbed it, reading over his shoulder. One of them screamed. Another cursed. The youngest started crying, mumbling something about forgiveness. I didn't move. I just watched. Watched as greed finally turned on itself. Watched as arrogance collapsed into fear. Neighbors began to peek from their windows. Curtains shifted. The quiet street filled with whispers. Everyone knew the story of the old man who died and the sons who celebrated. Now they were seeing the ending, And it wasn't the one my sons had planned. The second oldest stepped forward, face red, hands shaking. "You ruined us," he hissed. "You took everything." I looked at him and said, "No. You did that when you kicked my coffin." He opened his mouth to argue but stopped. He knew it was true. They all did. I took one last look at the house, the same house I built with my own hands, brick by brick, the house where I raised them, the house where they killed their own decency. It didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to a family who would care for it, one that knew what respect meant. I turned to leave. No one followed. No one dared. As I reached the car, I heard one of them fall to his knees behind me, sobbing into his hands. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Either way, it came too late. I opened the car door, paused, and looked back one last time. They stood there, silent, broken, surrounded by the ghosts of their own greed. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. Because that morning, they didn't just see their father return. They saw the man they buried rise from the grave to bury them instead. The days that followed were not loud. They were quiet in the way storms are quiet after they have torn the world apart. Nothing left to scream about, only pieces to stare at. My 5 sons stopped talking to one another. The same men who stood together to laugh at my coffin now looked at each other with suspicion and hate. Greed doesn't share grief, it feeds on it. Each of them believed the other had caused it. Each believed someone else still had something left to steal. The first lost his house within a week. The bank came for it, the mortgage unpaid, the accounts frozen. He tried to argue, but the papers were sealed tighter than any door he could break through. The second tried to sell the trucks from my old company yard, only to find out the ownership had shifted to the workers' cooperative. They wouldn't even let him on the lot. The third drank. I heard about it from a neighbor. He sat in the same bar where I used to take him when he turned 21. Only now, he sat alone. He told the bartender his father's ghost had come for him. The bartender called it nonsense, but fear doesn't need logic. It just needs memory. The fourth tried to apologize. He showed up at the lawyer's office with flowers and tears. The lawyer told him the truth, that I wanted no messages, no contact, no visits. The fifth, the youngest, sold his car and disappeared. Last I heard, he'd moved to another state. Maybe he thought distance could bury shame. It never does. The town talked. People who once nodded politely to my sons now crossed the street. They weren't cruel. They were careful. Everyone had seen how greed can rot a name. My sons had turned Lang from a name of respect to a word people whispered like a curse. I didn't hide what I had done. I didn't boast either. When people asked, I told them the truth. I didn't ruin them, I said. I just stopped protecting them from what they became. For months, I stayed quiet, lived simple, ate little, slept deep. I felt peace again, the kind that doesn't come from revenge, but from balance. Justice, not joy. One evening, I walked back through town. The sun was setting, the streets gold and empty. I passed by my old house. It was different now, painted white. Children's toys scattered across the yard. Laughter drifted through the windows. Real laughter. Not the kind that mocks, but the kind that reminds you life can still be good. The new family waved to me as I passed. They didn't know who I was. That made it better. The house was happy again, cleansed of the greed that once filled it. I kept walking until I reached the bridge by the river. The same river I used to take my sons fishing when they were small. I stood there for a long time, cane resting against the railing, watching the water move. The world goes on even after the worst of it. I thought of the coffin, the laughter, the cold ground, the sound of shoes kicking wood. I thought of how easy it was for them to mock the man who gave them everything. But I didn't feel anger anymore, only distance, like all of it belonged to another lifetime. Maybe it did. They had buried one man, the weak father who took every insult and stayed quiet. But another man rose from that grave, one who remembered what self-respect felt like. My revenge didn't end their lives. It ended their arrogance. It ended the belief that cruelty has no consequence. It showed them what happens when you bury love with greed. By the time I turned to leave the bridge, the sky was dark. The air smelled clean again. The 5 men who once called me father had learned their lesson the hard way. They had buried my body in laughter, and I buried their future in silence. People think revenge is loud, that it comes with shouting, fists, or flames. But it isn't. Revenge is quiet. It's the sound of a man finally closing the door on those who thought they'd locked him in a coffin. It's peace that walks slow and steady, without guilt or noise. I don't visit their homes anymore. I don't need to. Every now and then, I hear whispers. One working odd jobs, one moved away, one still trying to fight the system he never learned to respect. But I don't smile. I don't gloat. Because I didn't do it to watch them suffer. I did it so I could stop suffering myself. The truth is, they buried me long before that fake funeral. Every insult, every greedy glance, every cruel word, those were shovels hitting dirt. I just decided to climb out. They thought my silence meant weakness. But silence is where patience lives. And patience builds storms the loud never see coming. People ask me if I regret it. I don't. What I regret is loving sons who forgot how to love back. I gave them everything, not for praise, not for thanks, but because that's what a father does. And when they took it all for granted, I had nothing left to lose but my mercy. The world calls it revenge. I call it balance. They mocked my death. I made them meet the kind of death money can't fix. The death of pride, the death of comfort, the death of greed. When I walked to their door that morning, I didn't come to destroy them. I came to show them what they had already destroyed: our family, our name, our bond. Now, I live quiet. A small cabin, a chair by the window, coffee at sunrise, no noise, no demands. The peace of a man who no longer owes anyone anything. I keep one photograph on the table, not of them, but of their mother. She would have wept to see what they became. Maybe that's why I couldn't let it end the way it started. I had to finish it right. Sometimes I walk to the cemetery, not to my fake grave, I leave that to the weeds, but to hers. I sit beside her stone and tell her everything: how they laughed, how I rose, how the house she loved now belongs to a kind family, how justice, though late, still came. I tell her I'm sorry I had to become the kind of man who could do what I did, and then I sit there in silence until the wind moves the grass. When I leave, I always whisper the same words: "It's done now." Because it is. They kicked my coffin and laughed. I stood at their door and didn't need to raise my voice. In the end, I didn't just bury my son's greed, I buried my pain with it. That's what revenge really is. Not hatred, not cruelty. Just the calm after being disrespected for the last time. And for the first time in my life, I finally feel alive.